zoos occupy an uncomfortable space in the modern conscience, somewhere between conservation and confinement, between education and exhibition, between the genuine good that the best facilities do for endangered species and the undeniable reality that every animal behind that glass is living a life that bears almost no resemblance to the one its body and its brain were built for. Most zoo animals adapt. Most find a way to exist within the boundaries of their enclosure, to eat on a schedule, to tolerate the noise and the faces and the tapping on the glass, and to settle into a routine that is not natural but is survivable. But some animals do not adapt, because the gap between what they need and what a zoo can provide is so vast, so fundamental, and so deeply tied to the animal's neurology, its social structure, and its relationship with space itself that no enclosure, no enrichment program, and no amount of institutional good intentions can bridge it. These are 10 zoo animals that were never meant to be caged. Starting at number 10 is the polar bear. And the polar bear's misery in captivity is so well documented, so visible, and so difficult to watch that it has become the symbol of everything that can go wrong when a zoo tries to house an animal whose relationship with space is measured not in acres but in continents. In the wild, a polar bear's home range can exceed 200,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of California, across which it roams continuously. Following the seasonal movement of sea ice and the seal populations that constitute its primary food source. A polar bear in a zoo lives in an enclosure that is, on average, roughly 1/1,000,000th the size of its natural range, and the behavioral consequences of that compression are immediate, visible, and deeply disturbing. Captive polar bears are among the most likely zoo animals to develop stereotypic behavior, repetitive, purposeless actions such as pacing, head swaying, and swimming in identical patterns for hours. And the prevalence of stereotypy in captive polar bears is so high that a study published in the journal Nature found that polar bears in zoos showed signs of stress and behavioral abnormality at rates far exceeding most other captive species. A polar bear pacing the same track along the edge of its enclosure, back and forth, for 8 hours a day, is not exercising. It is experiencing a neurological response to confinement that researchers compare to the repetitive behaviors observed in humans held in solitary confinement. And the comparison is not rhetorical. The polar bear's brain is wired for constant movement across enormous distances, and when that movement is denied, the brain does not adjust. It loops. And the loop is what you see when you stand at the glass and watch a bear walk the same path it walked yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, with an expression that is not anger and is not sadness, but is something worse than both, which is the total absence of anything at all. A zoo curator who had spent over 20 years working with polar bears described the challenge of housing them as the single most difficult problem in modern zoo management, noting that no enclosure ever built had successfully eliminated stereotypic behavior in polar bears, and that the most honest assessment of the situation was that polar bears should not be in zoos at all. A conclusion that an increasing number of accredited facilities have reached and acted on by phasing out their polar bear exhibits entirely. Number 9 is the orca, and the orca's case against captivity has been made so thoroughly, so publicly, and so devastatingly through documentaries, lawsuits, legislative action, and the testimony of former trainers who described their experiences in terms that sounded less like animal husbandry and more like complicity in something they could no longer defend. That repeating the full argument here almost feels redundant, but the core facts bear restating because they have not changed. Wild orcas live in matrilineal family groups called pods that stay together for life. Not for a season, not for a breeding cycle, but for the entire lifespan of every individual, which can exceed 80 years in females. They swim up to 100 miles per day. They communicate in pod-specific dialects that are so distinct they function as cultural identities, passed from mother to calf across generations. They hunt cooperatively using strategies that vary by pod and by prey type, and that are taught, not instinctive, meaning each pod's hunting technique is a cultural tradition maintained through social learning. A captive orca lives in a concrete tank that is, relative to its body size and its natural range, the equivalent of a human spending its life in a bathtub. It is separated from its family, often permanently. It is housed with unrelated individuals from different populations that do not share its dialect and that it would never encounter in the wild. And the social stress of these forced groupings produces aggression, injury, and psychological deterioration that manifests in behaviors never observed in wild orcas. Broken teeth from chewing on concrete and steel gates, collapsed dorsal fins from the loss of hydrostatic pressure that open ocean swimming provides, and attacks on trainers that have resulted in multiple deaths. Most notably, the killing of trainer Dawn Broncho by the orca Tilikum at SeaWorld Orlando in 2010. Tilikum had been captured from the wild as a calf, separated from his mother, held in progressively smaller tanks, and involved in 3 human deaths across his captive lifetime, and his story became the subject of the documentary Blackfish, which generated a public backlash so powerful that SeaWorld ended its orca breeding program and its theatrical orca shows. A marine mammal veterinarian who had worked with captive orcas for over 15 years described the captive orca as an animal that is cognitively aware of its own confinement in a way that most captive species are not, adding that orcas possessed the intelligence, the social complexity, and the emotional depth to understand that something was wrong with their situation even if they could not articulate it, and that this understanding was itself a source of suffering that no enrichment program could address. At number 8 is the African elephant, and the elephant's unsuitability for captivity is written in every measurable metric that zoo science has available: lifespan, reproductive success, infant mortality, foot health, psychological well-being, and the simple, damning statistic that elephants in zoos live, on average, roughly half as long as elephants in the wild. Wild African elephants live into their 60s and 70s. Zoo elephants frequently die in their 40s, and many do not reach 40 at all, succumbing to conditions that are rare or non-existent in wild populations: obesity, arthritis, foot infections caused by standing on hard, unnatural substrates, and a complex of stress-related disorders that veterinarians group under the term captivity-associated pathology, which is a clinical way of saying that the elephant's body is breaking down because the environment it lives in is not the environment it was built for. Wild elephants walk up to 30 miles per day. They live in multi-generational matriarchal herds of dozens or hundreds of individuals. They form bonds that last decades and grieve their dead in ways that are difficult to interpret as anything other than emotional processing. A zoo elephant lives in a space measured in thousands of square feet rather than hundreds of square miles, in a social group of 2 to 4 individuals that were assembled by curators rather than by kinship, and on a substrate that damages its feet with every step it takes. An elephant welfare researcher who had studied captive elephant populations across North America for over 2 decades described the zoo elephant as an animal that is dying of captivity, slowly, measurably, and in plain sight, and noted that the data on captive elephant longevity, foot health, and reproductive failure was so consistently negative that the ethical case for keeping elephants in traditional zoo exhibits was, in her professional assessment, no longer defensible. Number 7 is the great white shark, and the great white shark is on this list not because it suffers visibly in captivity the way an elephant or an orca does, but because it simply refuses to survive in it, dying so quickly and so consistently in aquarium settings that the species has become the definitive example of an animal that cannot be caged at any scale, with any technology, under any conditions that humans have been able to devise. No aquarium has ever successfully kept a great white shark in long-term captivity. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, one of the most advanced and best-funded marine facilities in the world, attempted to exhibit great whites on multiple occasions between 2004 and 2011, and the longest any individual survived was 198 days before it had to be released, because it had stopped eating, was losing weight, and had begun bumping repeatedly into the walls of the tank in a behavior that researchers interpreted as either navigational distress or a deliberate attempt to escape. Great whites are pelagic. They are open ocean animals that swim constantly, covering thousands of miles per year, and their physiology is built around continuous forward movement in a way that is incompatible with the bounded, finite space of any tank. They are ram ventilators, meaning they must keep moving forward to force water over their gills, and while they can slow down, they cannot stop, and the psychological and physiological stress of swimming in circles in a confined space produces rapid deterioration that no feeding protocol or water quality system can prevent. A marine biologist who had been involved in the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Great White Program described the species as the animal that taught us where the limits of aquarium science are, adding that the great white's refusal to survive in captivity was not a failure of technology or husbandry, but a fundamental incompatibility between the animal's biology and the concept of confinement itself. If you're enjoying this countdown, you can get early access to all Loving Feral videos over on our Spotify channel. The link is in the description. Number 6 is the snow leopard, one of the most elusive and most solitary big cats on the planet, and an animal whose entire existence in the wild is defined by qualities that captivity systematically denies: solitude, vast territory, high altitude, extreme cold, and a relationship with vertical, rocky, mountainous terrain that is so central to its biology that a snow leopard on flat ground is, in a very real sense, a snow leopard out of context. Wild snow leopards range across home territories of up to 600 square miles in the mountains of Central Asia, at altitudes between 9,000 and 18,000 feet, and they are so solitary that individuals actively avoid each other outside of mating season, communicating through scent markings and scrapes rather than through direct contact. A snow leopard in a zoo lives in a fraction of that space, at sea level or close to it, in temperatures that are often warmer than its body was designed for, surrounded by the noise, the smells, and the visual stimulation of thousands of daily visitors. Conditions that are, for an animal that evolved to be alone in silence on a frozen mountain, the neurological equivalent of living in a nightclub it cannot leave. Captive snow leopards pace. They hide. They develop stereotypic behaviors at rates that concern even the most optimistic zoo welfare researchers, and their reproductive success in captivity has been inconsistent enough that the species' captive population requires careful genetic management to avoid the inbreeding that small, confined populations inevitably trend toward. A big cat keeper who had worked with snow leopards for over 15 years described them as the most beautiful and the most heartbreaking animal in any zoo, noting that the snow leopard's response to captivity was not dramatic or destructive, but quiet. A gradual withdrawal into stillness and repetition that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it, and impossible to unsee once you were. Number 5 is the cheetah, the fastest land animal on Earth, and an animal whose entire physiological identity, its lightweight skeleton, its oversized lungs, its semi-retractable claws, its flexible spine, and its ability to accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3 seconds, is built around a single capability that captivity makes completely irrelevant. A cheetah that cannot run at full speed is a cheetah that cannot be a cheetah. And no zoo enclosure on Earth provides enough linear distance for a cheetah to reach its top speed, which means every captive cheetah is an animal carrying a body that was engineered for the most extreme burst of speed in the mammalian world, and that has never once, in its entire captive life, been allowed to use it. Cheetahs in zoos are also prone to a constellation of stress-related health problems: gastritis, adrenal hyperplasia, and a chronic anxiety that manifests as hypervigilance, pacing, and a susceptibility to illness that is significantly higher than in wild populations, and their reproductive success in captivity has been so historically poor that breeding programs have struggled for decades to maintain genetically viable captive populations. A cheetah conservation biologist who had worked with both wild and captive populations described the captive cheetah as an animal that is permanently frustrated by an ability it can feel but cannot express, and noted that the enrichment programs designed to compensate, lure coursing, food puzzles, scent trails, were better than nothing, but were also, fundamentally, substitutes for the thing the cheetah actually needed, which was a flat, open landscape and something to chase at 60 miles per hour, and that no zoo could provide that without ceasing to be a zoo. Number 4 is the wolf. And the wolf's problem in captivity is not physical. Wolves are adaptable, hardy animals that can survive in a range of environments, but social. Because wolf's social structure is so complex, so dynamic, and so dependent on space, choice, and the ability to form and dissolve relationships freely, that confining a group of wolves in a fixed enclosure with no option to leave, no ability to disperse, and no way to resolve conflicts through the natural mechanism of distance produces a social environment that is chronically stressed, artificially hierarchical, and prone to aggression that does not occur in wild packs. Wild wolf packs are family units, a breeding pair and their offspring, and the social hierarchy is maintained not through dominance and submission but through parental authority and the natural process of juvenile dispersal, in which young wolves leave their natal pack to find mates and establish territories of their own. In captivity, dispersal is impossible, which means subordinate wolves that would naturally leave are trapped in a social structure they cannot exit. And the resulting tension produces fights, injuries, and a chronic stress load that compromises immune function, reproductive success, and the psychological well-being of every individual in the group. A wolf biologist who had studied both wild and captive wolf populations described the captive wolf pack as a family that is not allowed to grow up and leave home, noting that the aggression and the rigid dominance hierarchies observed in captive wolves, which formed the basis of the now discredited alpha wolf theory, were artifacts of captivity, not reflections of natural wolf behavior, and that the wolves people saw pacing behind zoo fences were not displaying their nature, but displaying their confinement. Number 3 is the octopus. And the octopus's unsuitability for captivity is rooted not in its size or its physical needs. Octopuses are relatively small, fully aquatic, and can be housed in appropriately sized tanks, but in its intelligence. Because the octopus is so cognitively complex, so behaviorally flexible, and so clearly capable of boredom, frustration, and problem-solving that confining one in a glass box raises ethical questions that most aquariums are not equipped to answer, and that the octopus answers for itself, repeatedly, by escaping. Octopuses in aquariums unscrew jar lids from the inside, disassemble valve mechanisms, squeeze through gaps that seem physically impossible for an animal of their size, and navigate out of their enclosures, across floors, and into other tanks, or out of the building entirely, as in the famous case of Inky, an octopus at the National Aquarium of New Zealand who escaped his tank, crossed the floor, and slid down a drain pipe into the ocean. The octopus's intelligence is not a cute quirk that enrichment programs can address with puzzle feeders and textured toys, although those help temporarily. It is a fundamental cognitive architecture that requires novelty, complexity, and the ability to manipulate its environment in ways that a glass tank with a lid cannot sustainably provide. An octopus in captivity that has solved every puzzle, explored every surface, and mapped every corner of its enclosure is an animal that has run out of things to think about. And an animal that has run out of things to think about is an animal that is suffering in a way that is invisible to visitors but measurable to researchers. A marine biologist who had studied octopus cognition for over 20 years described the captive octopus as the most intelligent animal in any aquarium, and the one least served by being there, noting that the octopus's lifespan, typically 1 to 2 years, meant that every month in captivity represented a significant percentage of the animal's total life experience, and that spending that experience in a glass box was a waste of a mind that deserved better. Number 2 is the chimpanzee. And the chimpanzee's case against captivity is built on the same foundation as the orcas: cognitive complexity, emotional depth, social sophistication, and a capacity for suffering that is not analogous to human suffering but is, as far as neuroscience can determine, functionally identical to it. Chimpanzees in the wild live in communities of up to 150 individuals with social dynamics that include alliances, rivalries, reconciliation, political maneuvering, and relationships that span decades. They make and use tools. They teach their children. They grieve their dead. They have been observed engaging in behaviors that researchers describe as ritualistic. repeatedly throwing stones at specific trees in patterns that have no obvious functional purpose, and while the interpretation of these behaviors is debated, the cognitive complexity they imply is not. A chimpanzee in a zoo lives in a social group assembled by curators, in a space that is a fraction of its natural range, without the ability to choose its companions, leave a conflict, or engage in the full range of behaviors that define chimpanzee life in the wild. Captive chimpanzees develop depression, self-harm, abnormal aggression, coprophagy, and a suite of psychological symptoms that primatologists describe using the same diagnostic criteria applied to human post-traumatic stress disorder, because the symptoms are the same. A primatologist who had spent 30 years studying both wild and captive chimpanzee populations described the zoo chimpanzee as an animal that knows something is wrong with its life, but cannot identify what. And that expresses that knowledge through behaviors that are indistinguishable from human mental illness, adding that the most disturbing thing about working with captive chimpanzees was not the abnormal behaviors themselves, but the recognition that those behaviors were rational responses to irrational conditions, and that the chimpanzee was not broken, it was responding correctly to an environment that was. And at number 1, the zoo animal that was never meant to be caged more than any other species on this planet is the migratory bird. Not a single species, but the entire category of birds whose biology is built around the act of long-distance flight, and whose confinement in aviaries, no matter how large or how well designed, denies them the single behavior that defines their existence. Arctic terns migrate over 44,000 miles per year, from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back, covering a distance equivalent to 3 round trips to the moon over a 30-year lifespan. Bar-tailed godwits fly over 7,000 miles non-stop across the Pacific Ocean without eating, drinking, or landing. Peregrine falcons, which are kept in captivity for falconry and in zoo exhibits, are the fastest animals on Earth, capable of diving at speeds exceeding 240 miles per hour, and no aviary ever built allows them to reach even a fraction of that speed. The migratory bird's body is not designed for confinement. It is designed for the opposite of confinement, for a life defined by movement across hemispheres, across oceans, across the entire surface of the planet. And the denial of that movement produces a condition that ornithologists call migratory restlessness, or zugunruhe, a state of agitation, wing fluttering, and directional orientation that captive migratory birds exhibit during the seasons when they would normally be in flight. And that persists for weeks or months as the bird's internal clock and hormonal cycle tell it to fly while its enclosure tells it that flying is not an option. A captive migratory bird experiencing zugunruhe is not misbehaving and is not ill. It is responding to a biological imperative that is as fundamental to its existence as breathing. And it is being told by its environment that the imperative cannot be fulfilled, which is a form of suffering so deeply embedded in the animal's physiology that no enrichment, no diet, and no amount of space within an enclosure can address it. A conservation ornithologist who had worked with captive bird populations for over 20 years described migratory birds in zoos as animals that are homesick for a journey, noting that the zugunruhe response could not be trained out, medicated away, or designed around, and that a migratory bird in an aviary during migration season was an animal whose entire body was telling it to be somewhere else, somewhere thousands of miles away, somewhere it had been before and needed to return to. Somewhere that its genes remembered even if it had been born in captivity and had never seen it, and that keeping an animal in a cage while its biology screams at it to cross an ocean was, in her assessment, one of the most quietly cruel things that well-intentioned institutions routinely did to animals they claimed to be protecting. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. You can get early access to upcoming Loving Feral videos on our Spotify channel. The link is in the description. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or share it with someone who looks at zoo animals and wonders whether the glass is protecting the visitor or trapping the exhibit. See you in the next one.